In the last lecture, we learned that JavaScript engine executes a function by creating an execution context and executing it inside the call stack. But how does this execution context is created? And how JavaScript engine executes the code of a function in execution context? That's what we are going to understand in this lecture. So in the last lecture, we learned that when a function is called, a new execution context is created for that function where the function code is executed. The execution context of the current executing function is always put on top of the calling function execution context. So for example, here we have a very simple JavaScript code. There, first of all, we are creating this global variable app, and then we are declaring this function get account details, which is taking two parameters, customer ID and name, and inside that we are declaring two variables, bank and branch. And we are also creating an inner function inside this get account details function called print details. And then we are also calling that print details function from within the same get account details function. So when this JavaScript code will be executed by the JavaScript engine, first it will compile this JavaScript code into machine code, and then it will start executing this JavaScript code line by line. And when it will start executing this JavaScript code, first of all, it is going to create a global execution context. In this global execution context, all the top level codes, all the codes which is present in the global scope, that will be stored. So in this example, this app variable and this get account details function will be stored in this global execution context. Then here we are also calling this get account details function, and we are passing the value for customer ID parameter and the name parameter. So when this get account details function will be called, an execution context for this get account details function will be created, and it will be pushed to the call stack where that execution context will be executed. And this execution context, the execution context for this get account details function, it is going to store all the information about this get account details function. It is going to store the value of customer ID and name parameter. It is going to store the value of bank and branch variable, and it is also going to store a reference to this print details function. And when this print details function will be called here, for this also an execution context will be created. And in this print details function, it is going to store all the information about this print details function. So this is how an execution context gets created for each function whenever that function is called, and there the code of that function gets executed. Now JavaScript engine, it creates execution context for a function in two phases: creation phase and execution phase. In the creation phase, JavaScript engine is in the compilation phase, and it just scans over the function code in order to compile it. The code is not executed in the creation phase. Now, in the creation phase, JavaScript engine does three things. First, it creates a variable environment. Then it also determines the scope chain, and it also determines the value of this keyword. Let's understand it in more detail. So if we associate the execution context with an object, then we can say that in the creation phase of execution context, JavaScript engine performs following three tasks. First, it creates the variable object. In the last lecture, we learned that the execution context stores all the necessary information which is required in order to execute the function. For example, it stores all the variable declarations and the parameters which we are passing to that function and the inner functions, etc. So all these informations are stored inside the variable object of the execution context. Variable object is basically a property of the execution context which contains all the variables, function arguments, and the inner function declaration information. Now remember that here we are associating the execution context with an object. In reality, there is no object which gets created for the execution context. But to make things simple to understand, we are associating the execution context with an object, and there we are saying that for that execution context object, we have a property for variable object, we have a property for scope chain, and we have a property for this keyword. Okay. Now, once the variable object gets created, the JavaScript engine also initializes the scope chain, which is basically a list of all the variable objects inside which the current function exists. And this also includes the variable object of the global execution context. And scope chain also contains the current function variable object. Now, if this statement does not make any sense right now, don't worry. We are going to learn in detail what is a scope chain and how the scope chain is created during the creation phase of execution context. And we are going to learn about it in one of the lectures of this section. Then, after the variable object and scope chain is determined, the JavaScript engine also initializes the value of this variable in that scope. Now, we have already learned how the value of this variable is determined based on where we are using it in one of the previous lectures of this course. But again, we are going to have a look on how the value of this keyword is determined during the creation phase of execution context in one of the lectures of this section. Now, once the creation phase is complete and all these three properties are created and initialized, then comes the execution phase. In the execution phase, JavaScript engine will again scan through the function code. It will update the variable object with the values of the variables, and then it will execute the code. Now again, we will talk about execution phase of the execution context in great detail in one of the lectures of this section. In this lecture, we are going to focus on the first step of the creation phase, and that is the creation of variable object. All right. So far we have learned that an execution context is created in two phases, the creation phase and the execution phase. In the creation phase, the JavaScript engine creates a variable object, it determines the scope chain, and it also determines the value of this variable. Now, let's learn during the creation phase of execution context how the variable object is created and what information does it store. And let's understand it with a code example. So again, here I have a very simple JavaScript code. Here we are creating this app variable in the global scope, and we are also creating this getAccountDetails function in the global scope. And then we are calling this getAccountDetails function. So as we have learned, when this JavaScript code will be executed by the JavaScript engine of the browser, first of all, it is going to compile this JavaScript code into machine code, and then it is going to execute this code line by line. So during the execution, first of all, it is going to create a global execution context. And in this global execution context, it is going to store all the global variables and all the global functions. Now, if we have a closer look on this global execution context, first of all, as we learned, for an execution context, we are going to have a variable object, the scope, and this variable. So for this global execution context, the variable object is going to store this app variable and it will be assigned with this uninitialized. That's because during the creation phase, when this variable object gets created, the JavaScript engine is simply going to scan over the code. In this case, it is going to scan over this JavaScript code. And there it will find that it has this app variable. So it is going to create that variable, but it is not going to initialize it. Here in this code, this app variable is initialized with this value JS demo, this string value. But during the creation phase, it will simply create this variable, but it will not initialize it with the value which we have assigned to it. Instead, it will initialize it with this uninitialized. That's because we have created this variable using const keyword. So when we create a variable using const or let, at that time during the creation phase, those variables get initialized with this uninitialized. If we create the same variable using var keyword, in that case, that variable will be created and it will be assigned with the value undefined. All right. So in the global scope, we have this app variable and we have this getAccountDetails function. So with this name app and with this name getAccountDetails, we have two properties created inside this variable object. The variable is assigned with the value uninitialized, but this function which we have created here, we have created it using function declaration syntax. So a property with that function name will be created, and this is going to store a reference to this function definition in the heap memory. We have learned that the function is of reference type and it gets stored in the heap memory. So in this variable object, a property with the function name is created and it is going to store a pointer to this function definition in the heap memory. Then for the global execution context, the scope is always going to be null because global execution context is already created for the variables and functions which is present inside the global scope. So there is no other scope outside of the global scope. right? So for the global execution context, the scope will always be null. And since we are running this JavaScript code in the browser, we have learned that in browser, in the global scope, this variable always points to Windows object. So that's why here for the global execution context, this variable is going to be assigned with the window object. Then we are calling this get account details function. And when this function will be called, an execution context for that function will also get created. And if we have a closer look on the execution context of get account details, it will look something like this. So here again, for this execution context also, we will have a variable object, the scope, and this variable. So during the creation phase of this execution context for this get account details function, JavaScript engine is going to scan over the code of this get account details function. Now what it is going to do, it will see that this function is taking two parameters, customer ID and name. And during calling this function, we have passed these values for those parameters. So for the parameters, a property inside this variable object will be created, which is called as arguments. So this arguments is an object. And inside that object, these parameter names will be stored. And there the property names are basically the index of the parameter. So this customer ID is present at index 0. So the property name is 0. And this name parameter is present at index 1. So the property name is 1. So this arguments object is basically going to store the name of all the parameters which we have specified for that function. And it is also going to have a length property which will tell how many parameters that function is taking. And we have already seen this arguments object in one of the previous lectures of this course. In the previous section, we talked about the arguments object which can take n number of arguments, right? So this is same arguments object. Then after this arguments object is created, we will also have properties with the parameter name. So this function is taking two parameters, customer ID and name. So with those parameter names, we will have a property inside this variable object, and it will be assigned with the values which we have passed for those parameters while calling the function, as you can see. Then JavaScript engine is also going to scan over the inner code. There it will find that we are declaring two variables, bank and branch. So it is going to create these two variables as a property on the variable object, as you can see, but it is not going to assign it with the values which we have actually assigned to those variables. Instead, it is going to assign them with this value uninitialized, because as you can see, these two variables are created using const keyword. So as I mentioned earlier, a variable created using let or const will be assigned with this uninitialized during the creation phase. The actual values will be assigned to these variables only during the execution phase, but the execution phase has not yet started. We are currently in the creation phase. So during the creation phase, the variables are created, but they are not assigned with the actual values which we have assigned to them. Instead, they are assigned with this value uninitialized. All right, then we are also creating this print details function inside this get account details function. So a property with this name will be created. And since we have created this function using function declaration syntax, this property is going to store a pointer to this function definition. This function will be stored in the heap memory, and that memory address this property is going to store. It is going to store a pointer, a reference to that function definition in the heap memory. Then the execution context of this get account details function is also going to have a scope and the value for this variable, but we will talk about it later in our coming lectures. Let's not focus on the scope and this variable in this lecture. Then inside this function, we are also calling this print details function which we have created here. And we have learned that when this function will be called, an execution context for that function will also get created. And this print details function, it is not taking any parameter, and it does not have any inner variable declaration as well, or any inner function declaration. So the execution context for this print details function will look something like this. There also we will have the variable object, and inside that variable object we will have a property called arguments. But since this print details function is not taking any parameters, this arguments will have only a length property which will be set to 0, because here we will not have any other property, because this function is not taking any parameter. And then inside this function, we are also not declaring any variable or inner function. So that's why you will not see any other properties also inside this variable object. All right, now let's understand variable environment with one more example. So here again, I have a very simple JavaScript code, but here we have a lot of variables and a lot of functions. These variables and functions are created in different ways. So we will understand how the property for these functions and variables will be created and what they are going to store. So again, when this get account details function will be called, an execution context for that get account details function will be created like this. And if we have a closer look on the execution context of this get account details function, it is going to have the variable object, the scope, and this variable. So during the creation phase, when the JavaScript engine will start scanning this get account details function, when this function has been called, first of all, it will find that for this function, we are taking two parameters, customer ID and name. So inside this variable object, it is going to create the arguments property, which will be assigned with an object. And in that object, we will have two properties with the index number, and those properties will be assigned with the parameter present at that index. So this we have already learned. And after this arguments object is created, the properties for this customer ID and name parameter will also get created, and it will be assigned with the value which we are passing for those parameters when calling that function. Now, inside the function, JavaScript engine will find that we are creating this bank variable, and we are creating this variable using let keyword. So it is also going to create a property with this name bank inside this variable object. And since we have created this variable using let keyword, that bank property will be assigned with uninitialized. In the same way, we are also creating this branch variable created using const keyword. So a property called branch will be created. And since this variable we are creating using const keyword, here during the creation phase, this branch property will also be assigned with this value uninitialized. Now we are also creating this variable quarter. So again, a property called quarter will be created, but this time we are creating this quarter variable using var keyword. And when we create a variable using var keyword, a property with that variable name is created during the creation phase in the variable object, but this time it is assigned with the value undefined and not with uninitialized. So this is the difference when we create a variable using var keyword and when we create a variable using let and const. Okay. Then we are also declaring this print details variable. And here we are using function declaration syntax. So a property with this name print details will be created, and that will be assigned with a pointer to this print details function. So here this print details, it is going to store a reference to this print details function, which is stored in the heap memory. Then we are also creating this greet function, but this function we are creating using function expression syntax and not using function declaration syntax. And in a function expression syntax, what we do is we create a function using anonymous function syntax and we assign it to a variable. So in the end, this greet is nothing but a variable which is storing this function. And since this variable is created using var keyword, in the variable object, a property with this name greet will be created, and that will be assigned with the value undefined because this greet variable is created using var keyword. Then we are also creating this welcome function, and again we are creating it using function expression syntax. So a property called welcome will be created in this variable object, but since this variable is created using let keyword, it will be assigned with this uninitialized. In case of variable created using var, it was assigned with undefined, but this welcome variable is created using let keyword, it is assigned with uninitialized. And this is the reason why in the very beginning of this lecture we learned that when we create a function using function declaration, we can use it before it is declared. But when we create a function using function expression, we cannot use it before it is declared. And this is the reason why. We can use a function declaration before it is created because during the creation phase, this print details function is already available and it is pointing to that function definition. And that's why we are able to use it before the function is created. But in case of function expression, since the function expression is basically a function assigned to a variable. That variable is either going to be assigned with undefined or uninitialized. So during the execution phase, when we try to use a function expression before it is declared, we are basically trying to call either undefined or uninitialized as a function. And because of that, we get an error. And don't worry if this does not make any sense right now, because we are going to understand it in great detail in our next lecture. But this is the reason why we are able to use function declaration before it is declared, but not the function expression before it is created. And this all is happening during the creation phase of execution context. The execution phase of the execution context has not yet started. All this is happening when the JavaScript engine is scanning the function code. That means variables and function definitions are already present in the memory before the execution of the function has actually started. Okay, so to summarize, an execution context gets created in two phases: creation phase and execution phase. In the creation phase, the variable object, the scope chain, and the value of this variable is determined. And in the variable object, the argument object is created, which contains all the arguments that were passed into the function. Then the code is scanned for function declaration, and for each function declaration, a property is created in the variable object pointing to the definition of that function. This means that all the functions will be stored inside the variable object even before the code has started executing. Right, because during the creation phase only, we have created a property in the variable object with the function name, which is storing a reference, a pointer to the function definition, which is stored in the heap memory. And lastly, the code is also scanned for the variable declarations. And for each variable, again, a property is created in the variable object, and that property will be set either to undefined if that variable is created using var keyword, or it will be assigned with uninitialized if the variable is created using let or const keyword. And the last 2 points is what is generally called as hoisting. There are some functions and variables which are hoisted in JavaScript, which means they are available to use before the execution phase has actually started. And this we are going to understand in our next lecture. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.